Okay, welcome everyone to Crucifixion of the King of Glory. This is chapter 7 that we're going to be reviewing tonight. I'm actually kind of glad that these chapters are not long. I don't know about the rest of you. I feel like there's a lot in it, like it's very dense. And if every chapter was 20, 30 pages long, I'm not sure that I'd get nearly as much out of it. So at least for me anyway, this is the way actually that I kind of prefer to read, short bursts. And then I abort it one particular book and go to another. So anyway, I hope that you like that too. Let's say a prayer real quick, and we will begin the discussion. O heavenly King, O Comforter, O Spirit of truth, Lord, that farewellest all things, treasure of good things and giver of life, come and dwell with us and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls. All right, very good. So welcome everyone. We've kind of have this practice, which I like actually, where we go around to make sure that if anyone has a specific thing that they want to make sure we talk about during the talk while we're together, that we do that. So let's kind of open things up to folks so that they could talk about things or call to mind things that are really important that we want to make sure we don't miss. And I'll take a few notes and make sure by the end we've at least talked about those things. So does anyone have anything like that they'd like to talk about, things that really struck them that you want to make sure that we cover before we go in? And Paula's got her hand raised here, so I'll let her talk, and that'll be a good test to see if you can hear her through my microphone.
So I'm glad that it made sense. This chapter made finally a lot more sense than before, because 2 chapters ago she was talking about the temple. And so, why did Jesus get so mad? I mean, yeah, okay, they were in the temple, they were selling, but it was not just that. He couldn't have been mad for a few birds being sold.
Right.
It was the whole corruption. And that's why this is the second catalyst. That's why they couldn't forgive him for that, because he exposed them.
Right. So does everyone hearing Paula? Can you hear her through the microphone? Okay, good. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty crucial chapter from that point of view too. It made things make a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's very good. Anyone else have something that they want to make sure that we talk about? And we are going to talk about the corruption a lot. Well, not a lot, but it's a good, I would say about a third of the notes cover that. Oh, welcome, Jetta. Okay, anyone else? Lucy, I see you have your hand raised, and okay, now you're spitting up. That's great. So perfect. Still good. Good that she's with us. Anyone else have anything that they want to make sure we talk about before we leave tonight? All right, then let's just kind of go through it. As usual, I took some notes, and I'll share those with you at the end. I have to add something. I had something in mind, and I forgot, but I wrote it down longhand, so I'll add it to the notes later tonight and put it in. So let's start on the page 65, which is the first page of the chapter. And she writes, Jesus' most provocative action was driving the merchants and the money changers out of the temple precincts, which unquestionably contributed to his arrest and crucifixion. Okay, so first of all, when we talk about temple precincts, she uses that nomenclature because remember, only the temple proper itself was a building. Everything else was open courts. So those guys were not selling doves and changing money in the temple proper, in that part where only the priests could go, the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies, right? So that building, which is the far eastern part of the temple complex, is the temple itself. But they called the whole thing, all the courts, everything, they called that the temple, like the Temple Mount, right? So when she says the temple precincts, she means not just the building itself, where the Holy of Holies was, but she means all the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of the priests, all those things, the court of Israel that we talked about when we went through it in great detail. So that's why she uses that. This is the first time she uses that word precincts, but that's what she's talking about, the whole complex. So why not complex? I don't know. I guess it's a stylistic choice. What I wanted to call your attention to here is that she talks about the synoptic gospels and then John's gospel. So the synoptic gospels are the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They essentially go over the same information, not 100%, but essentially go over the same information. And that's why they're called synoptic. That is, they align with each other. And John's is completely different from that point of view. Now, there are various reasons for that, but sometimes you'll even see an explanation of the gospel, like Archbishop Averki's explanation of the gospel that was published recently by Jordan Bell, like within the last 3-4 years. He sort of covers the synoptic gospels together as a group, all three, and then talks about John's on the side. Synoptic John, synoptic John. So if we don't know what that synoptic is, then this all doesn't make any sense. So when we say synoptic gospels, we're talking about the first three, and John's is not considered part of the synoptic gospels because he takes a different approach. He also wrote it considerably later, probably in the year 90 or later, whereas the other gospels were written probably in the years between 20 and 35. So it's a different, according to the best I would say, academic scholarship and the tradition of the church. So it's not a question that John's was written later, and he was written while he was already on Patmos, as far as we understand. So anyway, that's what they're talking about there. And she makes an interesting point about why John's is likely to be more accurate. So the synoptic gospels say that Jesus did this cleansing of the temple towards the end of his ministry, where John argues that it was towards the beginning. But again, John is focused more on Jerusalem. The other three are focused on Galilee. It's just like, it's a different perspective. And that's good, because it really, those different perspectives are very useful. So Lori has her hand up.
In the footnote on that page at the bottom, he says, John's gospel describes many trips by Jesus to Jerusalem, whereas in the synoptic gospels, they only mention it once. Do you know why?
Yeah, because they're so focused on, those synoptic gospels talk more about his ministry in Galilee, whereas John focuses more on his time in Jerusalem. So they just have different perspectives. John's focus is on Jerusalem, is on the ministry that he had there, and the others are looking at his time when he's in the north.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Anioti has his hand raised too.
John also said the other three took care of everything else, and he was just adding to the
Right.
to the story.
Right. Because he wrote last, his goal was to fill in the things that they had not covered particularly closely, or maybe that John had a different perspective. Remember, they were all older than him. He was the youngest by far of the apostles, so he had a different perspective. He had also been caring for the Mother of God from the time that Christ was crucified until she died. So he also got her input, where the other three didn't have that direct input. So it's really a blessing for us that we have two perspectives on the life of Christ. And like I said, John's is more focused on Jerusalem, where the others are focused more on Galilee. And I'm not leaving you, but I forgot to grab my water, and I can feel that I need to have a drink here. So I'm back. Okay, so just a small point, but I thought was interesting. Remember, we talked about how the priests had to certify that people were free from leprosy before they could rejoin the community. There's also a note here about that the animals that were used for sacrifice in the temple had to be without blemish. That is, they had to be perfect. And the priests were the ones who would examine the animals and make sure that they could be used for sacrifice. Remember, we talked about how they used to pick the bugs out of the wood, like you couldn't have bugs in the wood that was used for the sacrifice. Same thing. So they were very, very careful about that. And I think what I thought of is about how we also bring our best to God. Leviticus talks about that all the time, how we should always bring our best to God. So when we come to church, if we're in charge of the food, we shouldn't take the tomatoes off the vine that are not the best and bring them to church. We should use the best ones that we bring to God and leave the other ones for the family or whatever. So it's just I thought it was an interesting point. And I think that is exactly kind of a carryover into the New Testament, and probably why Leviticus says that a lot, that we should try to bring our best to God. So just something to think about. This chapter, we sort of touch on something and then something else. We go back to that thing we touched on before. So we'll talk about the cleansing of the temple a couple of times. We'll talk about corruption a couple of times. But on page 66, she first touches why did the temple need to be cleansed at all. So it's interesting that it may be that Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time when Christ did this, which lends more credence to John's account, because Caiaphas was the high priest when Christ was crucified. So John says he did it. Actually, it doesn't. It lends less credence to John's account and more to the synoptics. But anyway, did Caiaphas introduce a new practice of selling animals in the temple? So maybe they weren't doing that until Christ's time. That's something very interesting. But she goes through and talks about a couple of different options, but the real reason is that he was protesting the commercialization of the temple and the corruption of the high priest. This is really where it lands, and I think that this is an important point that we're going to talk about more this evening. But I think there's a few pieces that we want to talk about currency exchange first. And before we're I don't want to go too fast. Does anyone have questions or comments at this point? Okay, so let's do currency exchange. So I thought a couple of interesting points for us as we read the gospel. The bronze coins, which are used for most of the transactions, those are usually translated into English as pennies. So when we think about when we're reading the gospel and we see that word is used relatively often, pennies, they're talking about the bronze coins, not silver, not gold, but the bronze coins which people used to buy most of the things that they needed. Silver was already pretty expensive, and gold, of course, very, very expensive. The silver Tyre shekel was the temple currency. Okay, those were the 30 coins that Judas would have received from the chief priests, and those were very pure silver, much purer silver than the Roman silver coins. So that's interesting. They used those and they minted those specifically for the temple, so that they had a standard currency. It's kind of like the dollar is the exchange currency of the world right now. The silver shekel was the exchange currency of the temple. So everything worked according to that. So if you brought a Roman silver coin, you're going to need about 2 of those to equal one of the silver shekels that they used in the temple. And they understood that. They knew that. And that's why there was such a big business there of currency exchange. It's interesting to see how the concept of money there is tied exclusively to precious metals, right? They didn't have the idea of money that we have today. Like, we don't use a gold standard or any kind of precious metal or commodity standard for the United States dollar, right? Paula says we used to, and we did. It was during Nixon. I can't remember the years. I want to say
1972.
Yeah, in 72 we went off the gold standard. And so we don't have as much American currency in circulation as we have gold. Good, bad, it's just different. But they didn't have this idea of money as a hypothetical construct. Money for them was precious metal. So that's, I think, just something interesting for us to think about, and maybe adds a little something as we're reading the Gospels when money is talked about, because 1/3 of the parables which the Lord gave are about money. So it's obviously something that's important in our spiritual lives, mostly the right way to use that. But when we're hearing about money in the Bible, we're hearing about something which is pegged to precious metals, or which mostly was precious metals themselves. Okay, so that's just an interesting data, I thought. Okay, more about why cleansing the temple at all on page 68, and what was Jesus's motivation. So I think it's important for us to understand that it's very clear from scholarship that there was a lot of things going on there which were immoral from a financial point of view. There was corruption, a lot of it. For instance, the money changers were using dishonest scales. So that matters because everything's pegged to precious metals, right? Everything is a precious metal essentially. So if your scale is not even, if you've got it set up so that you get more money from the exchange than you should, well, that's a problem. That's corruption, right? So let's say that you're dealing in Roman coins to temple silver shekels. Okay, well, if you have it set up so that you make more out of that than the shekel is really worth, that's immoral. Now, it was understood that the people who changed the money were going to make some money from that. She said in there the expectation was 4 to 8%. The reason this was a little more complicated than just today, where I go when I'm at the airport, if I want to get euros, I wouldn't do it there, but let's just say I did it there. And I give them $100, and because it's at the airport, they give me 70 euros, let's say. Okay, it's just an exchange, right? But there, it's not like all of these coins were minted exactly the same, right? Every one was going to be a little different. It wasn't, like every bronze penny was going to be the same from, Italy as it was from Egypt, right? They didn't have any kind of standard. So what something weighed mattered. So you needed to know how much it weighed, and you had to estimate how pure it was. So there was a lot of opportunity there already for some sketchy sort of stuff. But when they were using scales which were not accurate, but were sort of set to make the person who was doing the exchange get more money, not the person who's giving the money, but the exchanger to get more money. So this is a kind of corruption. And actually, it's important to understand that in the Old Testament, it was explained in the law of Moses how it is that you're supposed to weigh things, how it is that you're supposed to give things. So a bushel of wheat, if you give a bushel of wheat is not a bushel flat, flat across the top. It's supposed to be overflowing, like flowing off the edge of the bushel. That's interesting. Like that is a specific command. So that shows us how that you're supposed to kind of actually lean towards the person who's in the interaction, not the person who's the merchant. The merchant should actually be taking less. The person who's in the mercantile interaction should be getting more, but they were doing this the opposite way. So they were ripping people off on the money changers. Well, maybe things haven't changed that much. Anyway, but that was what was happening there. Then it says directly, a den of thieves. You've made my father's house a den of thieves, right? So she specifies, we're talking about robbers here, like armed robbery, strong armed robbery. And of course, this is a quote from Jeremiah, and we have that in the church, actually. That quote is up in the new part of the church. My father's house shall be a house of prayer. But you have made it a den of thieves. So we're not talking about thieves who are stealing things subtly. We're talking about thieves who are threatening and taking things. And I think that's a really powerful kind of way to understand that. Since I was just in the airport yesterday and I spent $12 for a drink, it made me think that it's kind of similar to the way the airport cafes run now, right? They charge you a bunch of money because the airport charges them a bunch of money. And the same thing here. They were getting charged a lot, the people, because the chief priests were charging those merchants a lot to be there. So, but what's clear and important is that this was not when Christ was criticizing what was happening there, and when he chased out the money changers and so on and so forth, he was not making an attack on the temple. He called it his father's house. So he obviously was not going after the temple itself, but going after the corruption. Now, she makes a big point about, was this anger on Jesus's part? And I think that this is a really important piece, because for some reason the world completely obsesses about this. It wasn't anger, but he wasn't going to also get those guys to leave by saying, could you please leave? Right? It just wasn't going to happen. So he needed to make a ruckus to make it happen. And she says it's just a dramatic and symbolic act against the chief priests. So, I mean, it was the chief priests who were running things and making sure that Christ was found guilty, and that they were the ones who were leading the people. Release Barnabas, not Barnabas, Barabbas, released Barabbas instead of Christ. So the chief priest really had it out for Christ, and because, in many ways, because of this particular action, he was really destroying their business, quote unquote. Okay, Jesus Christ as the temple. We talk about this in this chapter, and it's really a really important Orthodox Christian teaching. We conduct the bloodless sacrifice. That's why in the ancient times, and still, correctly speaking, we don't really have priests, we have presbyters. We call them priests because it's just, that's almost our shorthand. But if you look at actually the paperwork that the priest receives when he's ordained, it doesn't say he's a priest. It says he's a presbyter, because that shows that he's not doing what the priests used to do in the ancient world, which was sacrifice animals. But he has the right, by the grace of God, through ordination, to conduct the bloodless sacrifice of the divine liturgy. So we say priest, and that's fine. But strictly speaking, there is not a priest in Christianity. There are presbyters who perform that bloodless sacrifice. Christians have never sacrificed animals. It's never been part of our worship ever since the time of Christ, since the temple ceased to be the house of God. And that's because the sacrifice of Christ is the perfect sacrifice forever. There's nothing that could match that, and so there is no more animal sacrifice. It's also interesting to read, and I didn't know this actually, that the Jewish blood sacrifice ceased when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. That I knew, but on the same day that the Babylonians destroyed it, that's interesting. So I don't know if you caught that little detail in the chapter, but when the Romans destroyed it, it was the same day on the calendar when it was destroyed by the Babylonians. So, Leta has her hand raised.
John being cheeky, asking, does that mean we are all Presbyterians?
No, but we have presbyters. It's funny that that they call themselves Presbyterians because they don't consider that communion is the body and blood of Christ. But anyway, that's a long conversation. But probably not. At least not since they started to use those words. Yeah, Pete.
However, the wives of presbyters in the Greek church are called presbyteres.
Yes, isn't that interesting? And that recalls, Pete says in the Greek church, the wives of priests are called presbyteres, like the wife of a priest. It's very interesting that we still have some of that within our nomenclature. And it's not that we're never called presbyters. Like I said, it just became that the priest is called priest. And there's nothing wrong with it. But to distinguish between what priests did in the ancient world, which was sacrifice animals, and what we do today, it's good to understand that the presbyter means it's not someone who sacrifices animals. So we may be able to use that to help people to understand. Jeremiah is kind of all over the place here. Paula would like to see who's here. Jeremiah is kind of all over this chapter, and that really makes a lot of sense because Jeremiah, first of all, is one of the prophecies which is read on Holy Saturday, and it is this 31st to 33rd chapter, which she often quotes. Very important prophet, and Jeremiah was killed for his prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. He just made a prophecy, which turned out to be completely true, but because of his prophecy, he was killed. And this is one of the reasons, and one of the main reasons, that the chief priests wanted to go after Christ. Because on one hand, from a theological point of view, it would mean that the house of God is no longer there, and therefore God is no longer with Israel. But I think that Eugenia makes it pretty clear in the chapter, that's not the issue. The issue is the business. And they're able to get people riled up about that, about the destroying of the temple, because of course everybody knew that that's why Jeremiah was killed. It wasn't like it was a secret. That's why the prophet Jeremiah was killed, because of his prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. So the chief priest used this to egg on the people to destroy Christ. But then the next kind of logical point is, well, if the temple is destroyed, the buildings, has God really abandoned Israel if he's there with them as God and man as Jesus Christ? Of course not. Of course he hasn't abandoned it. So there's a lot of not playing with words, but there's just kind of this back and forth between using temple as a building, using temple as Christ's body, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But I want to talk a little bit more about the corruption of the priests, because I'm just following how she did it in the chapter. But I see Linda has her hand raised.
So they were more threatened by the lack of business through the temple than they were of God abandoning them.
That seems to be the issue. Yeah, and she's implying that, and that I think has always been the implication in the gospel. This isn't something, I don't think she's breaking like major new ground here, because when Christ was welcomed into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, pretty much everybody agreed that he was God. That wasn't a question, that he was the Messiah. But the high priests, the chief priests, and from the chief priests is chosen the high priest. Essentially, they didn't even necessarily disagree with that. It just wasn't the Messiah that they wanted. So they liked the prophecies of the Messiah that would lead one to believe that he would be a military leader, like that he would throw off the Romans and that the Jews would take over the world and everyone would be subject to them. That's the part they liked. They didn't like the other part, which was a Messiah of love, a Messiah of suffering. They just didn't. This was not the Messiah they wanted. They wanted the Messiah that was going to get rid of the Romans, essentially. So they kind of hoped, I guess, that they sent this one back, that they'd get a better one. So it wasn't that they disagreed that he was Messiah. I'm sure there was some debate, but after Lazarus was raised from the dead, there was really no question in the whole society. They wanted the Messiah that was going to be the warlord, essentially. And so that's when he also threatened their business, it made sense that he should go.
Is there
Hope that
anything
answers the question.
Torah that would?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Is there anything in Torah that would actually implement that idea of their Messiah?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, some of the prophecies about the Messiah talk about him, conquering the world, about his great strength, and so on and so forth. But conquering the world for them, that meant let's march out and take it over. For God, that means Christ conquered the world with the gospel.
Yeah, he did.
Right? And so it's a matter of interpretation, right? For them, those people who were the head of the society, it would have been a pretty good situation for them if the Jewish people took over the world, since they were in charge of the Jewish state. So they really didn't like the Romans being over them, and that was the first thing they wanted the Messiah to do, was get rid of them. But this whole idea of taking over the whole world, they also liked that. But they thought that would be military, whereas it's spiritual, obviously.
Well, and they had plenty of problems
I feel like
choosing.
Wait 1 second.
know,
That Paul is saying something, and then probably everyone can hear her. So go ahead and say.
So, I mean, I'm from Rome, so there is no way they could be like the Romans. Okay, the Roman Empire was huge, but maybe I shouldn't say it, but it feels like right now that's what they're trying to do. They want to assert their power.
Yeah,
And that's all I'm going to say. That's it.
good. You have to go ahead and finish your thought, and then Linda has a question.
It's in history of Jewish people, right? That they constantly would choose not God, but something else.
That's true, but then there would be like a renewal, a revival,
Right.
and they would come back to God, and that's usually like the parable of the vineyard, right? The master sends his servants, and then finally in the end he sends his son, and they kill the son because they think, okay, well, we get rid of this guy, then the vineyard is ours. But yes, it's true that the Jewish people kind of came to God, went from God, came to God when he would send them prophets. But he sent his son to straighten everything out. And a lot of Jews followed Christ. A lot did. I mean, all the first Christians were all Jews, right? So it's not that they just abandoned him completely, but a lot did, because they preferred the more power focused side, which is what a lot of people prefer in the world, honestly, if we're honest about it, rather than the spiritual side. Linda has a question.
So the parallel that I'm feeling or getting is that, the fallen angels where, Satan opposes God and Satan becomes Satan. It's like if the high priest knew or acknowledged that he was the Messiah and they went forward with his destruction, this is to me like Satan embodied, because it was more of a satanic thing than, we're trying to save the temple by keeping our power and not causing confusion or angering the Romans and showing them we have control. To me, it was like more insidious. It was like more satanic. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a lot of evil going on, and so I think that there, from the spiritual point of view, absolutely. And there's also all this corruption going on. That doesn't happen. That corruption doesn't happen from God. Like, that's not something that's motivated by God either. So it's obvious that there's a lot of problems happening here. And if we look at Christ's ministry, it was very highly focused on trying to reform the Jewish people and to bring them back to God. But not everyone, and in fact, not most, followed him. And so, Christ also came for people who were outside the Jewish tribes. And thank God, I'm very thankful for that, because that means that most of us here who are on this call have a place in the kingdom of heaven. Not because we were born into any particular tribe, but because we're at least trying to hearken to the gospel. So good. Okay. So we talked a few weeks ago about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's really what's happening here. There's this. I think this is really important for all of us who are in the church, and especially for the clergy, to be really wary of this. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking how interesting it is that our bylaws in the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia have several specific things in them that try to make this temptation much more difficult for the clergy. And I'm thankful for that. So like, they don't just hand me the checkbook and say, go to town. That's not something. If I ever had to sign a check, it has to also be signed by another member of the parish council who has the right to sign those checks. So and that's just one thing. There's several things in the normal parish bylaws that try to take this temptation away, and I think that's great. It's nice that we learn from that. So anyway, that's just something that caught my eye as I was thinking about this. On page 72, she mentions about how Christ was in the tomb for 3 days and then rose again. And sometimes people have questions about that, because the way that we think about time in the West is not the way that people think about time in the East. And so if Christ is crucified on Friday and he rises on Sunday, that's 2 days in the West. But that's not how we count things in the West. When something happens, that day is 1, it's not 0. So it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday is the 3rd day. And Christ rose according to the tradition of the church, on the first instant of Sunday, because he did not want to deprive the world of him, this temple, any longer than he needed to. So that's why we celebrate at midnight. Now, some Christians used to celebrate at dawn. Very interesting, because in the gospel it talks about how they went at dawn to the sepulcher. Some societies have the idea that the day begins at dawn, that it ends at sunset and it begins at dawn. Others think of it as, well, it's midnight, so that's the new day. Neither one of those things is wrong. It's just a way of understanding time. So, I'm glad that we think of this as being at midnight. I think that there's really something great about that extra struggle and that extra excitement. And it makes a lot of sense that God, who created us out of love, also wants to not deprive us of himself for any longer than is needed. And therefore, we celebrate the resurrection of Christ at midnight.
At 3,
What's that?
3 a.m.
3 a.m.?
Yeah, that's when we go to eat.
We end, yes, that's when we go to eat. Yes, Maniote.
I think the passages that that say that Christ rose on the third day are easier to not comprehend, but to see than the ones that say he was in the tomb for 3 days. Because the way you explained it, Friday is the first, Tuesday, Saturday is the second, Sunday is the third. It's just, for me, it's easier to conceptualize he rose on the third day. It's just for me. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it's also action. It's an action verb, and we're more attracted to action than we are to verbs which are passive. So yeah, that I however it works, it's good. But I think the most important thing is that we understand that in the church, when something happens, that's day one. So a lot of times somebody will die and the family will be like, okay, the 40th day is on this day. I'm like, well, really doesn't matter because there's no time in the next life, but the 40th day is actually the day after, but whatever. So it just depends on how they're handling the grief and how we talk about that. But yeah, everything starts when something happens, that's the first day. So anyway, I just thought it'd be useful to take a little time away from our narrative and talk about that. Okay, good. I would like to talk a little bit about Jesus as the temple of God, and then we'll kind of go towards the end then. So, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This is what Christ says to the chief priests, and his disciples are there too, so they hear this. So the chief priests immediately thought about the buildings. That's their thing. Like that's where their focus is, and that makes sense. The disciples were simply confused. Remember, they hadn't been enlightened by the Holy Spirit yet. So the fact that they're confused, I think that also is good for us when sometimes we're like, well, I'm a little confused. Okay, well, apostles were confused sometimes too. So, but with God's help, we figure it out. So the disciples were confused. No one really understood what he was talking about until he was risen. And then it says the disciples understood that his body, not the buildings, was what he was talking about. So why would we equate Jesus with the temple? Why did he equate himself with the temple? Because the temple in Jerusalem was regarded as the presence of God on earth. This is how the Jews understood this. Right? We have to understand. He's living in this Jewish society. He's speaking to Jewish people. He's going to be talking in a enculturated way that makes sense to them. Now, sometimes he pulls in the Roman part too, because they're also a part of the thing. But here he's talking to the people so they understand this. So the temple was regarded as the presence of God on earth. But now the temple building doesn't need to play this role anymore because God himself has become flesh and was physically present on earth. So I think we talked a few weeks ago about how actually after Christ's crucifixion, the temple began to physically fall apart. Until it was finally destroyed by the fire in the Romans. Actually, the Romans didn't destroy it as much as the people who came to scrape the precious metals off the rocks. But in any case, the Romans certainly got it started. One more key point, and it's one of the last paragraphs of the chapter, but I think it's really important. So I decided we should read it in full. So let me read that for you. Worship of the Lord would no longer be centered at the temple, nor would it require the blood of animals. For the Lamb of God poured out his blood, creating the new covenant that Jeremiah had foretold. God would be worshipped spiritually, and the law would be spiritual, written on the people's hearts. The temple of Jesus' body, which the chief priest had sought to destroy, would become the body whereby the faithful would commune with God in spiritual worship, in every epoch, in every conceivable culture, language, and location. Every individual believer receiving Christ through Holy Communion will become a living, breathing, walking, talking temple of the living God. So this is a really crucial point in our spiritual lives, in the way that we understand the world, in the way we understand our salvation and the way we understand the church. That we have no more blood sacrifices. In fact, I probably mentioned here, but I'll mention it again. Blood is not allowed on the altar at all. None. So if somebody cuts their hand when they're serving, which that happens once in a while, they have to go out. You cannot have blood in the altar because there is no more blood sacrifice at all, and the church takes it so seriously that it just doesn't allow that even to be in the altar at all. So I think this is an important point, and that we become the temples of God when we partake of Holy Communion, and that plays into the sermon which we will have this Sunday, actually, but as long as I am still alive then. But I think that it's really important for us to remember that we're not just some other animal floating around the place here. We're the temple of the living God. If we make ourselves so, we can either become the abode of God, or we can become the abode of the devil, and that's a choice we make. So anyway, that's a little preview of what the sermon will be this Sunday. All right, so that's, I kind of just talked about the things that I thought were important and interesting. Like I think the money thing is interesting, isn't it? That like money was always considered to be precious metal, and now it's not. I'm not saying that was good or this is good. I'm just saying that's interesting. That's an interesting point. And probably all of us understood that before I said it, but I bet a lot of our young people would be really surprised to hear that there was ever such a thing as a gold standard. Or if they think gold standard is something like Russian standard, some kind of vodka. So anyway, I think that it's interesting. So I think it's good to bring up those points too, because they do help us when we read. Like we don't have to like transport ourselves back to first century Palestine. That's not what I mean. But to know when they talk about money, they're talking about precious metal. That's interesting and good. I think it's useful when they talk about the temple precincts, to understand it's not just the temple where the Holy of Holies is, that's the whole complex they're talking about. Those kind of things I think are interesting and helpful for us as we read the gospel. Or like, how do you count in the church? Everything begins, the first day when something happens is 1, not 0. Those things help us in reading the gospel and trying to live an Orthodox life. At least I hope they do. So, any questions about this chapter or anything else? You have to raise your hand. Go ahead.
So I remember somebody we know had said something about, well, how can we have kiosk in our church, and sell stuff? It's forbidden by, if Christ would be here, he would strike us out of church.
So I'll repeat it just so Paula can hear it. So that said that somebody visited us and said, well, how can you sell candles and things like that in the church? If Christ was here, he'd chase the kiosk ladies away, just like he chased away the money changers. So the question is one of corruption, right? Like how corrupt is it? Hopefully it's not corrupt at all. We actually talk about candle prices, for instance. Like you have to be reasonable. Of course, the candles get marked up, but should they be marked up like 10,000%? That would be rather corrupt, I think. Whereas to mark them up so that we cover the cost of shipping and don't lose money on candles, that seems reasonable to me. So the question is one of corruption, and I think that that's really a useful answer to somebody who asked that question, because if we're providing a service, Christ was not upset that they were changing money or that they were selling the animals. All those things had to be done in order for the temple to function. It would not function without that. His focus was on the corruption of the priests and the corruption of the vendors. So we have to keep an eye on those kiosk ladies for sure, to make sure that they're not getting too corrupt over there. But yes, as long as we're not being corrupt about this, then it's just fine. But if we are, then it's not. Paula wants to say something. She may have some inside information here. Hold on.
Yes, I see it as a donation. Like I bought a book. I'm going to buy this book, $20.
Mhm.
Okay. And this is money that I'm donating to the church. I could have bought it for 15. It's
On
okay.
Amazon or something. Yeah, just save a few bucks
It's-
on Amazon. Yeah.
I mean, this is money that we all use.
Sure.
It's not money that goes in the personal pockets of Albina or Svetlana.
Right.
It goes in our pockets.
Correct.
As a church.
Sure, it's
So-
absolutely from that point of view. Jeff Bezos probably has like 3 or 4 yachts already. He doesn't need another one from buying more things on Amazon.
Probably.
But I think that it's a matter of degree, you know. So, and I think that it's something we have to be careful about. For instance, we have signs all over the place that say candles and phosphorus as a donation. The cost that's listed there, it's a suggested donation. And I think that that's important to have that mindset that we ask you to do this, but if you don't have it, just take it. If you don't have the money, just take it. And it even says that on the signs. And I think we have to have that approach that this is, you know, a suggested donation, but it's not, you know, you don't have it, you take it for free. And we have to be comfortable with that as church people. Otherwise, yeah, then we will be beginning to violate that. So anyway, that's a good question, Elieta, and I think that that's how we understand it. Paniotti had his hand raised.
Yeah, the way, back to the cleansing of the temple and the kind of the same thing that we're just talking about. I think she wrote that the difference was between anger and righteous indignation.
Mhm.
And then there's kind of a pretty clear line between there. And the anger is more, you know, personal and emotional, where righteous indignation kind of indicated, well, in this case, a lack of morals. You're calling it corruption, but it's really a lack of morals and ethics.
Mhm.
More than he was angry, like he was boiling mad angry. It was a different whole different mindset, like you're saying. It was he was just calling them out because it's, you know, what's wrong with you guys, you know.
Mhm.
You shouldn't be doing this. It's
Right.
not.
Right.
It's not right. He wasn't angry, mad at him, like, you know, you're gonna go to the devil because of this. It's just, you know, you know what the commandments are. Why are you straying from them? You know, where's your moral
Right.
compass here? You know.
Mhm. Right, exactly. And not if you,
And I
I
think
mean,
we're
he
in the
talks
same
about
thing as
that.
with candles and books, you know. And it's a good point. The money's going to the church. It's not going in someone's pocket. That's a good point.
Right.
That's a
Right,
very good
which
point.
makes it different than what was happening there. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think that we have to stay on our guard because, you know, anything that has to do with money can very easily go sideways. So that's why I'm very, very thankful about the way that the bylaws sort of essentially force us to if you want to be corrupt, you got to really work at it. Like you can't just fall into it. And I think that that's good because the harder it is, the more likely people are to do the right thing. So anyway, good. Yeah, that's a good discussion, and I think important. So thank you for that.
Mhm.
Any other questions or comments about the chapter before we say goodnight? Yeah, so far I've liked all the chapters, but I found this one kind of like, I don't want to say pivotal. I'm not really sure, like, but it was a lot of good and important information that I think, like, the reason that I thought we should read this book in the first place is that it really enlivens the gospel. Like you really, that we go through Holy Week at such a fast pace. Like we just blow through it. I understand it seems long, you're in church every day, but it's not. We're just like that. All of those things, we just go so fast. And by reading this, I really think it brings that time of year, that really most important time of year, Great Lent, and especially Holy Week and Bright Week, it really brings it to life. So we understand more of the context of what's happening. So at least for me, that was really, really useful after I listened to the book last year before Holy Week, and now this year reading it before. And I hope you feel that way too. I hope it's going to make Holy Week, I think it will, a lot more interesting and meaningful for you. So, all right, so we've gotten just about to 8 o'clock, and we'll do one more call for questions or comments, and then we will pray and we will say good night.
We can say the Our Father for the school.
Yeah, and it's 8 o'clock anyway, so, or close to it. So maybe first we'll say Our Father, because we're trying to do that, everyone to say Our Father at 8 o'clock every single night, asking the Lord to bless the work that's happening in the school. I'll happily report that at the school liturgy this morning, between teachers, students, and parents, we had 22 people, and that's something I'm really, really thankful for, because I think that's important. If we're going to have an Orthodox school, that should be a differentiating characteristic, that the teachers and the students they pray together, and that the kids see the teachers there with them. So anyway, let's say Our Father, and then we'll sing It Is Truly Meet, and we'll say good night. Our Father, who art in the heavens, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation,
and deliver us from the evil one.
It is truly me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and blameless and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word, the very thing of constitutionally man. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Father. Good night.
See you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Should I make a